Thank you. Welcome, Amar, to Conversations with BrandKnew, published by ISD Global. Thank you for doing this for us. Let me begin by asking you, do you think we are witnessing a crisis of leadership in government, business, and community, especially in the last few years?
That's a great question to start with. I wouldn't call it a crisis in leadership because I see examples of great leaderships, great leaders all over the world, while we also see examples of bad leadership. And I don't think any of it is new or recent. If you go back in history, you're going to see great examples of leadership and not so great examples. I like to focus on the positive. And, in my book, I tried to bring in some of the examples of what not to do, but I also wanted to have a lot of examples of what to do, some role models in business, in government, in, sports, all different walks of life, because I believe there are a lot of examples of great leaders out there, and we can learn a lot from them.
Lovely. So this brings me to the next question, Amar. Do you think leadership is a coachable trait?
Absolutely. That one is something that I believe in 100%. Otherwise, I wouldn't work as an executive coach myself, right? When it comes to leadership traits, I call it a learned skill. Another way to look at it is it's a muscle that you can work out, just like you go to the gym and you work your biceps, or if you're training for a marathon, you have to run, a certain amount of miles every day. The same applies for leadership. It is a learned skill. One of the words that I use a lot in my leadership talks, in my leadership coaching, is intentionality. You gotta be intentional. Yes.
I love that word. I love that word. It's got so much of energy.
Yeah. So you got to be intentional about how you show up as a leader, right? There are some aspects of your personality that are there. There are some aspects of your childhood and upbringing that are there. And all of these are going to impact your leadership style. But I believe the biggest impact on how you show up as a leader is what you are intentional about, right? If you want to be a better listener, you're not just going to show up on autopilot. You have to be intentional about what you do and what not to do, right? You and I are having a conversation now, and I'm sure you're intentional about your listening skills. You don't have a cell phone in front of you, right? With messages blurring and notifications coming all the time, because you're intentional. You want to focus on the conversation. So from that simple example to all other aspects of leadership behaviors, I believe leadership is coachable, with one condition though. The person needs to be willing to be coached, right? The person, you can't convince someone to do something if they don't want to do it. So if the leader wants to improve, I believe that they definitely can improve.
Yeah, so you have to, you can take the horse to the water, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah. So over the last 2 years, especially considering what the world has witnessed, in terms of modern humanities, one of the biggest healthcare crises, and you being a healthcare well-being professional, what has been the learnings and insights that you would want to kind of carry forward, instead of preparation in terms of receptiveness, in terms of mindsets, what kind of insularity could we build in, for something that might happen again? Hopefully not, but, how do we prepare ourselves for something like this?
Another great question, Suresh. And I'm going to focus my answer not so much on the epidemiology of things and the transmission of the disease and all of that. I will leave that to people who are way more experts in that area. What I want to focus on is what can we learn from it on the leadership side, right? And I believe the biggest lessons that we can take from the global pandemic are lessons about resilience. How do leaders keep going in the midst of a crisis like this? And I believe for us to learn these lessons, we need to change our point of view about what resilience truly is. In many parts of the world, especially in the Western world, resilience has been understood as endurance. That if you just grind it out, if you just power through it, just keep on suffering and suffering and suffering, then you are demonstrating resilience. And the research and the science and the latest evidence shows that this is not resilience. What resilience is about is how do you recharge? How do you refuel? How do you make sure that you are taking care of yourself as a leader so that you can build your own self-resilience? And when you do that, then you build the resilience of your team and your organization. So I believe the biggest lesson is a lesson about how do we take care of ourselves as human beings, as leaders, and how even in the midst of chaos and craziness and crisis, like is happening in many parts of the world, especially on the healthcare organizational side, how do leaders and providers and nurses and employees find ways to recharge, refuel, so that they can go back and show up the following day as the best versions of themselves. I focus on that aspect of what we can learn from the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I think there are no two cues that have come in, because earlier we were taught speaking about IQ and EQ. Then I think the pandemic told us there could be probably RQ and AQ, which is the resilience quotient and an adaptability quotient, which is probably the need of the hour, right?
I love that language. I love that. Yes.
Yeah. So, and by the way, Amar, I love the titles of both your books, Intangibles and the next one, the ambitious one. So, coming back to your first book, going back to your first book, which Intangibles, the unexpected traits of stoic and healthcare leaders, high-performing healthcare leaders. And that came out in 2017, which is a good 2.5 years before the pandemic broke out. Okay. Are you itching to kind of add something in the book post the pandemic experience, keeping in view what these people have gone through, especially in the context of what you just shared, resilience, tenacity, perseverance, adaptability, and all of that?
What a great way to think about, those leadership traits, do we need to add something to them? So just to give a little bit of background about Intangibles, which, as you said, came out in 2017. So Intangibles is a research-based book that really asks the question, what does the science tell us about the traits of high-performing leaders, especially in healthcare? And the science pointed us into the direction of 4 main traits. And these traits are empathy, kindness, generosity, and humility. Okay. Now, this was pre-pandemic.
All of them probably revolving around the principle of stoicism.
I would
probably say that, add self-control to it. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah. I would say stoicism is not very far from these concepts. Self-control is not far from them at all. If I were to put another label, I would say these are unexpected traits, as the subtitle of the book says, because prior to that, if you had asked anyone to name a high-performing leader, maybe they would say overconfident, decisive, right? Bangs on the table, yells loudly, and all of that. And
type A plus personality.
Type A personality, exactly. Overachievers, right? And the research shows that it's not that. It's actually those maybe so-called softer traits. However, they have to be combined with competence. They have to be combined with courage. They have to be combined with ambition. Now, back to your question, all right, what did the pandemic teach us about whether we need to add something or not? I would say the pandemic emphasized the importance of these traits, because we were just talking about resilience, right? Now, we touched on how you build your own resilience, but how about how do you build your team's resilience and your organizational resilience? Well, every evidence is out there to show us that if you want a resilient team, you have to show them empathy, compassion, kindness, gratitude, right? you have to have these behaviors in place so that your team feels like, okay, if I continue to put in extra effort every shift, my efforts are appreciated, and I know that my leader has my back. So I wouldn't say that the pandemic showed us that we need different traits. I would say it showed us that we need to double down on these important traits.
It brought them right into the front and center, I guess.
100%, yes.
Yeah. So what was a trigger point, because there is, I'm sure books don't happen overnight, it must have been brewing in your mind. So what was the trigger point that caused you to write your first book, Intangibles?
When I started my job as a professor of healthcare administration about 18 or 19 years ago, I started noticing some things in the classroom, but also when the students graduated from the master's degree and went out there into the workplace and into the healthcare field, I started noticing a few things. And one of them that I noticed is that we tend to reward the type A personalities, as you said. We tend to reward the louder individuals. We give them better grades. We give them more opportunities. We promote them more into leadership positions. But I noticed that these are not always necessarily the best leaders. Sometimes the best leaders are more the humble ones. The best leaders are more, maybe the quiet ones, the ones that are a little bit introverted, but they're very analytical. They're very intelligent. They know how to interact well with other people. So those observations led me to start thinking about, okay, I don't want opinions on leadership. I want evidence, right? There are tons of books on leadership that are the opinions of experts, or a retired CEO writes a book. And I like these books. I read them all. But I felt that there was a need for a book that is evidence-based, that asked a very simple question, which is, what does the evidence tell us about the traits of high-performing leaders, especially in healthcare? And as we mentioned in the previous question, the evidence showed those four main traits. So that was kind of like that trigger for me to go on that journey and try to understand what the traits are.
Lovely. Leading that into the next thing that I wanted to ask you, AMER, servant leadership, humble leadership. Do the twain meet?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a lot of overlap between the two concepts. The whole idea of servant leadership is that you put your ego on hold and you focus on how you can be of service to your team and to your organization. Now, I know a lot of people talk about servant leadership. A lot of people call themselves servant leaders, right? And I think that's the ultimate irony, because when you call yourself a servant leader, you probably are not one. This is not something you call. This is not something you call yourself. Other people have to put that label on you. You don't call it yourself. But there was, there is an interest in the concept of servant leadership, but I felt like it's not sticking. I felt like we were not seeing a lot of examples of leaders in high-level positions who were embodying the servant leadership model. And in my opinion, part of that is because there was not a lot of evidence behind it. A lot of people thought about it and like, okay, well, yeah, servant leader, yeah, I'd like to call myself that, but I'm not really going to do it, right? Because it sounds like you need to sit on the sidelines. It sounds like you need to be passive when you're a servant leader. And who knows if you'll get promoted or not, or you'll get noticed or not. So with that in mind, I wanted to look at the research behind things. And the research shows that one of the most important aspects of servant leadership is this concept of humility. And when it comes to humility, the surprising thing, Suresh, is there is tons of research behind that concept within the context of leadership. I went through all the papers that have been published in the last 15 years only, right? Just the last 15 years. Papers in peer-reviewed leadership and management journals, robust research from all over the world. This is not just in the US. We're talking about research coming to us from China, from Singapore, from Portugal, from all over the world, all pointing in the same direction, which is this concept of humble leadership makes a lot of sense if you want to have a long-term impact as a leader. If you want to have long-term success as a leader, but also for your team and for your organization.
Brilliant. So I'm sure you have a vast reservoir of experience, a wealth of insights that you've garnered as you researched and wrote the book Intangibles, which you would have migrated and brought in into your new book, which again, congratulations, brilliantly titled Ambitious. Tell us the journey on that front.
Sure. So as I mentioned, Intangibles showed us that there are those four traits, empathy and compassion, kindness, generosity, and humility. Now, after Intangibles got published, I had the great opportunity of traveling and talking about the findings of that research.
The good old days of travel.
Yes, exactly. These were the good old days, exactly, when you just got on a plane and didn't think about it twice. And in interacting with groups from all over, I noticed that of all these four traits, the one that was the least understood and maybe even the most controversial was the humility one. Because every time I would talk about the humility, people will ask questions and say, well, yeah, okay, I'd like to be humble, but wouldn't I be perceived as weak? Or wouldn't people think that I'm passive, or I lack assertiveness, or I don't have confidence in myself? So that showed me that this concept of humility is probably not that well understood. And that's why I decided that in my next project, I wanted to focus mostly on humility, because I wanted to understand how humility can be a strength and not a weakness. But also I wanted to understand what else should be there with the humility. And what I found is that humility is a strength, not a weakness, but it is a superpower when combined with ambition. It is that perfect combination. When you have the humility and ambition together, then you can really conquer the world as a leader. So that's kind of the journey that took place between the four traits of Intangibles and then that one trait in Ambitious, which is the combination of humility and ambition.
So you actually, I think, willy-nilly unearthed the new title for your next annex of this book, Humility is a Superpower.
Yes, it is a superpower when combined with ambition, because if you think about it, humility, on the one hand, allows you to have an accurate understanding of your abilities, right? It's not about underestimating your strengths, it's about accurately estimating them. It allows you to be a good listener, to be open-minded, to be appreciative of the people who are around you. So that's humility on one side. But we have also ambition on the other side, which is about not settling for the status quo, not accepting things as they are. It's about having a bold vision and executing that bold vision. It's about having the ability to hold people accountable, to have difficult conversations, to speak up in meetings. When we bring these two together, that's when we can have a lasting impact as a leader. In my work as an executive coach and in my conversations with leaders, I noticed that some of them are too ambitious, but are not humble enough, right? They set those bold visions and they want to go out there to execute them, but they don't stop to include others. They don't listen. They don't seek feedback. And as a result, they can't have success in the long run. They may have short-term success, but unless you work well with others and you have emotional intelligence like we were talking about earlier, you're not going to be able to build things in the long run. On the other hand, you have people and leaders who are too humble, but not ambitious enough, right? They are generous, they are understanding, they are open-minded and all of these things, but they're a little bit too timid. Maybe they're passive. They don't have the difficult conversations when these need to be had. They don't speak up on behalf of their teams when they need to speak up. And these types of leaders also cannot achieve success in the long run. It's only when we combine the humility and the ambition, then we can have that long-term success.
Absolutely. I think your intent with the book Ambitious is absolutely super significant. Okay. And which draws me to, if you allow me, there are two really seminal works, and I'm sure Ambitious also is going to be a really seminal work as we go down the path and look back, in a few years from now. There are two titles that come to mind, actually. One is Matthew Barzan's The Power of Giving Away Power, and Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy. Okay, so what kind of parallels and complementary traits / attributes would you kind of draw? And what are you brought into Ambitious?
I love those parallels that you drew there, Suresh. And if you don't mind, I will add another one there that also has a lot of parallels to Ambitious, which is Good to Great by Jim Collins.
Jim Collins, yeah.
Right. So if you remember what Jim Collins started with,
I think, sorry to interrupt, Amar, he's done, I think, an extension of Good to Great very recently, right? Sorry.
Yeah, Built to Last. Built to Last, and then he applied it to the, the social fields and all of that. So just to remind the listeners and the viewers and the readers of Good to Great and Jim Collins, he wanted to understand what differentiated the companies that made the leap from good performance to excellent performance. So they studied thousands of organizations. They looked at their financial performance over 15 years. And what they found was that there were 11 companies that were able to maintain high level performance for 15 years. So they went and they studied these organizations. Now, their intention was to study their processes and their structures. They were not even thinking about who is leading these organizations. But when they observed these organizations, they noticed that all 11 of them were led by CEOs that had some very common but unique characteristics. And these common and unique characteristics were that they were not what you would expect from a CEO leading a big company. They were not the divas and the prima donnas and the type A personalities and the, my way or the highway and the yellers and the screamers. They were not, none of that. They were actually very humble individuals, but they were not weak. They were very strong. They had fierce determination. They had ambition, but the ambition was not for the ego, for the self. The ambition was for the team and for the organization, which is a very similar concept to Ambitious. But remember, this was back in the early 2000s. And that research, showed us that for these 11 organizations, that is the case. But what I wanted to do is to see, all right, what evidence do we have since then that this is still valid? Especially that some of these organizations that Jim Collins studied, they haven't been doing that well since when those CEOs left. So I wanted to go back and see what does the research say, and does the research confirm what Jim Collins found back in the 2000s? And as we mentioned earlier, it did really confirm through hundreds and hundreds of studies that keep on pointing us in the same direction. You gotta be humble, but you gotta be ambitious. So I'd say, obviously, nothing in leadership is new, right? I didn't just come up with a new concept, right? I brought these two together, and maybe I packaged them in an easy to understand way by calling it Ambitious. But as you pointed out, this work rests on the shoulders of others, such as Jim Collins and Ryan Holiday and many others, because I think deep inside, this issue of battling our egos is a universal human struggle that we all face. And I know I face that myself. Here I am, preaching about humility and talking about it and writing about it. And I struggle with it myself at some points in time, in my career and on any given day, because we have an inclination to want to be seen. We have an inclination to be noticed. We want to brag sometimes. We want to talk more than we listen, right? We want to believe that we know better than anyone else. We want to believe that we're the smartest people in the room. It's a natural human inclination, but we go back to the coachability. we go back to the fact that you can coach yourself to rein that ego, to try to put it aside so that you can focus on serving others, so you can focus on how you show your team members that you really care about them, that you're grateful for their contributions, that you're open-minded to their opinions. So that's a very, very long answer to your actual question.
But it is a very authentic articulation. So thank you so much for that, Amar. In fact, just to dovetail there, I need to do, if you permit me, two things. One is there is also this book written by Alan Gannett called Creative Curve. Okay, and it is where he actually talks about, don't try to do anything which is really so tangential and so distant away from the familiar that it does not kind of resonate and strike a chord. So the best pieces of work, especially if you want to impact, influence, and inspire, is to kind of go with the familiar and then bring in a new dimension of novelty. So that, so whether it is a Ben and Jerry's launching a lavender flavor, but it was first launched along with a vanilla flavor. So they didn't come out with a lavender flavor overnight. So that is one thing that I want to tell you. And secondly, I think it is also when you talk about say leadership, somehow the wrong perception is that it's a top-down POV, point of view, wherein probably it could also be, again, borrowing from what you just shared, the POV could be a point of vulnerability. Right? We are in it together. I'm on the same bench as you are. It is not that I've got, wings and I've got horns and whatever it is. I'm not the hippo in the room. Right? We are in it together. Right?
Exactly. I love that hippo, the highest based person's opinion. Right? The research shows that the three most important words that a leader can ever say is, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? You knew where this was going. It's I don't know. And I don't know about your training, Suresh, but I remember my management training, when I took my first management course way back then, we were explicitly told not to say I don't know ever. We were told when you become the manager, you have to pretend like you know everything. And you never let them see you sweat. You never show any vulnerability. Your team members have to believe that you have all the answers. And what bad advice was that? Because really, when you who are you kidding when you pretend that you know everything? Your employees know that you don't know everything, right? So that vulnerability that you're talking about is so important in leadership. When you say, I don't know, but I will find out.
Right.
Or I don't know, but I need you all to help me find out, right?
Let us find out.
Exactly, let us find out together. Now, I know when we talk about these concepts, some people get a little bit nervous about it because then they start, asking, well, if you keep saying I don't know, then you lose all credibility. And I agree. This is not I don't know for every single question. Competence is a given. Competence is a must, right? You got to know your stuff. You got to be, you got to have the IQ and you got to have the knowledge of the area that you're managing. So that's a non-negotiable. But I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. You also have to show that sometimes you haven't faced that situation before, or that specific problem is a problem that you haven't seen before. And that's when you show your humility and your vulnerability. And you ask the team members to bring in their expertise so that we can solve the problem together.
Absolutely. I think, it's the openness to continuous learning and unlearning, right? Yeah.
The open-mindedness.
Leads me to the next one, Amar. In these days of probably death by PowerPoint and goldfish attention spans, right? And I'm referring it in the context of the fact that you're also a speech coach. Right? And what are the best attributes that you must have for audience retention and engagement? Because it's not that, and now you have multiple platforms. You have hybrid, you have online, you have, face-to-face. So what is the, I wouldn't want to call it a formula what is the endeavor that orators and thought leaders and keynote speakers should be actually keeping in mind, or even leaders, speaking in a general informal setting, to who are wanting to kind of impact and inspire? What should they keep in mind?
What an insightful question. I would say we need to bring in two things to the table. I say we need to bring first the facts, the numbers, the science, because without that, it's just your opinion. As Deming said, right? Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And people are tired of opinions. People want, I believe, more facts. However, I don't think facts by themselves are enough. We also need to bring in emotions. We need to bring in stories and inspiration and excitement. If you think about it, we have two sides of our brain. We have the right brain and we have the left brain, right? One is emotional and one is rational. So if we're really hoping to engage audiences and to impact them and to have them leave the room, whether it's a conversation, a meeting, or a big talk, if you were hoping for people to leave with something to think about and something to start changing their behaviors, hopefully, then I believe you got to engage both the right brain and the left brain. You got to show the numbers, show the data, but also share some inspirational stories and some emotional experiences that allow everyone to leave with something that they can relate to.
Just a small aside, permit me. I read somewhere, was it in Wired or Forbes, and one of this, I think, was it Sanitizer brand during the pandemic was struggling to get people to, interpret a message. Okay. So the way they did it was, that I mentioned, they used the balance of both rational and emotional, wherein they said that they brought in the statistics: 40% of American men do not wash their hands after using the restroom. Okay. And then they gave out the message, so there was a data and the emotion aspect of it that combined, and that, that nickel dropped, so to speak, far better. Yeah.
Yes, you have to bring in the two, and you said, is there a formula? Maybe it's not a formula in terms of 50-50, but both aspects have to be there. And as you know, I'm a professional speaker myself, and this is the balance that I try to strike when I'm giving a talk to, let's say healthcare leaders or to doctors or to business industry leaders. What they're there for is they don't just want to hear your opinion, right? Sure, you can offer that if you want, but more importantly than that, they want to know, is there evidence behind it? Is this a larger sample size than one, right? And can you engage them emotionally? Can you get them to connect with that message, not just at an intellectual level, but maybe at a visceral level?
Absolutely. I go back to your beautiful part of the articulation that you did about humility being a superpower. I'm tempted to ask you, Amer, do you think, because it can be such a force for good and such a superpower, do you think this is something that you can inculcate and it should be part of the K-12 curriculum?
100%. I believe that we need to reward humble behaviors at a very early age. And what do humble behaviors look at that age? Well, humble behaviors at that age would look like a child saying, I don't know yet, right? I want to learn it though. So in a way, what we're getting to here is, how do we encourage a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, like Carol Dweck talks about? But if you notice our educational system, we don't encourage that. We actually discourage the growth mindset. We want kids to look like they know everything already. And if they don't know it, we penalize them. So, they've done a lot of research among kids at very young age. And what you see is that the kids who are okay with not knowing, but who show this curiosity to learn and to grasp new concepts, these are the ones that tend to have better outcomes in the long run. And I believe these kind of behaviors is what we call in humility talk, we call it intellectual humility, right? It's recognizing what you don't know yet, but having an appetite to learn so that you can learn more, you can know more and more and more. So I agree with you, Suresh. I believe we are lacking a lot in terms of how we're teaching kids at that age. And if we start teaching them from an early age how to be open-minded, how to listen to each other, right? How to recognize when you don't know something, but also give them the ambition to learn and the ambition to set, ambitious goals. I believe that would be great for our educational system and for our organizations in the long run.
Just again, a small tangential departure. Just a few months back, I was talking to the dean of a leading university here, and I was very tempted to take those small moonshots, and I was telling, why don't we have a university of tolerance and diversity? Okay, this should be kind of, right from, K-12 going up to university, people should be actually practicing it, because it should be second nature. It should not be forced. So it does not come across as alien or intrusive or foreign or annexed or a satellite. You're grown up with it. It's so natural to you. And at a very impressionable age, if you can do that, you can make the world a far better place, which is probably the prime reason why the education system, because we're still in the industrial age of education. And I will probably share with you, with your permission, a couple of emailers that we've done, a little bit tongue in cheek, in terms of purposefully provoking what needs to be, so in our own small little way, trying to make those dents in the universe, I'll share with you over the email, I'll send it across to you.
I would love that. I would love that. And back to your point about the educational system, especially at a very young age. In the book, I share a video that I came across, and it's a video from a classroom from kids at an elementary school level, and it's kids learning about even and odd numbers. Okay, and the video is following them throughout the whole class session, and there is this one child who is struggling with the concept of even and odd numbers. Okay, so he insists that 5 is an even number, right? and he's just struggling with it because he's trying to make sense of it. And then you see 2 of his classmates, in a very gentle way, but in a very clear way, help him understand that concept. And after half an hour of back and forth between the kids, and it's not aggressive back and forth, it's gentle, but it's educational. The thing that he says is remarkable. At the end, when he finally grasps the concept, he says, I disagree with myself.
So
that
brilliant.
5 is an even number. I disagree with myself. How many leaders have you heard in your life, in the corporate world, that have said, I disagree with myself? If anything, in business organizations, in politics, in government, if we see someone say, I disagree with myself, we call them a flip-flopper. We call them someone who doesn't have convictions. Why do we penalize the person who changes their mind when new evidence appears? That is intellectual humility. And I believe, as you said, if we start teaching it at a very early age, then we will reap the benefits in our organizations and in our governments in the long run.
Absolutely. Again, Amar, all of us are stating the obvious when we say, yes, we are so driven by hitting those quarterly numbers, right? The C-suite, and there is Milton Friedman's business exists only to serve shareholders and all of that, which needs definitely revisiting. So in that context, how do we percolate this concept of, ambitious leadership and the path to hitting those quarterly numbers? Because that is a real on-ground reality pressure that these people are facing, right? How do we kind of balance it? Because, I mean, we want people to be gravitating towards this, the mode of ambitious leadership, and show them that, yes, it is possible. Any particular demonstration or any particular thoughts that you have on this,
Your question is so important because it talks about the time frame of how we evaluate things. What you're describing is the short-termism.
Right.
And when we only look at short-term results, then we're going to continue to hire and promote leaders who are not humble. In fact, we're going to continue to hire narcissists for leadership roles. But there's a difference between short-term results and long-term results. There's a difference between leadership emergence and leadership effectiveness, right? So if we're talking about narcissists, right? And again, I always look at the research and see what the research tells us. The research tells us that narcissists tend to be chosen more for leadership positions. They tend to be promoted more. They tend to be given more opportunities and better salaries and all of that. However, if you look at the long run, if we move beyond next quarter, if you want to see success over a long period of time, and especially over a career, then narcissists do not achieve much success because they're lousy team players. They're bad managers. It's all about me. They're so egocentric. So that shows us that there are two concepts at play here. There's the concept of leadership emergence, which narcissists do really well at. But the more important one is leadership effectiveness, which narcissists don't do that well at. And that's why we're talking about the ambitious leaders, because it is the ambitious leaders that achieve that long-term success. This question of time frame is so important, and it reminds me of a management theory called the chocolate cake model. Okay. I don't know if you heard of that one.
No, I've not.
The chocolate cake. All right, so Suresh, imagine that I bring a big, huge chocolate cake for you now, and I say, here it is, but you have to eat the chocolate cake, the whole thing, in one sitting. You can't leave the table without finishing the whole thing. The first few bites are amazing, right? You're enjoying the richness and the texture and the flavor. The same thing applies to interacting with a narcissist. The first few times that you meet them, which typically is the interview process, you enjoy talking to them because they tend to be very charming. They tend to be very convincing, right? They're exciting. They're telling you stories. They're telling you what you want to hear. So you end up hiring them. Back to the chocolate cake, though. If you eat more and more and more of that chocolate cake, and now you're down to your fourth slice or fifth slice, you are not enjoying that chocolate cake anymore. You're starting to feel nauseous. The same applies to dealing with the narcissist in the long run. If you're interacting with them day in and day out, if you report to them, if your boss is the narcissist, you are not enjoying that relationship at all. Because again, they are not giving you any credit. They are taking all the credit and they're giving you all the blame for when things go wrong. So you're not enjoying that relationship. So I believe the time frame issue is such a crucial issue in understanding the traits of highly effective leaders. If we only want to focus on the short term, then sure, we can forget about humility. But if we care about longer term results, then it has to be a humility with ambition.
Absolutely. Which brings me to the tail end of this wonderful conversation, Amer. Over the practice and as a professional coach, educator, writer, author, which are the people and books that have really, really kind of made a mark, inspired you?
The books that have impacted me a lot, I would say, I mentioned it a little bit today. It's a book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, where she talks about the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. And if you go deep into this concept of the growth mindset, many of the traits of the people who have growth mindset overlap with the concept of humility, with the concept of viewing every situation or every interaction that you have with another person, not as an opportunity to prove yourself, but as an opportunity to improve yourself. The difference between proving and improving is huge in how we approach any situation, right? If I want to prove myself, then it's all about me. If I want to improve myself, then it's all about the learning. It's all about the opportunity. So I'd say Growth by Carol Dweck, Mindset by Carol Dweck is a great one. The other one that I really like is Quiet, the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking.
That's such a beautiful title as well. Yeah.
Right. And what I like about that is it shows you that it doesn't always have to be the loudest person in the room that has the best idea, right? And it's not an attack on extroverts per se. It really just says that we have to understand the power of introverts on our teams, and we have to accommodate a little bit more that introverts need a little bit more time to process things, a little bit more time to think through things, but sometimes they might come up with the best ideas. So I like that one a lot. And then another one is the one that you mentioned earlier, which is Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, where he talks about how we need to keep our ego in check at different stages in our lives, especially after a failure, after a success, right? And how that concept kind of evolves depending on what stage of our career we are in. And you know, as you know, Ryan Holiday brings in those amazing historical examples from Stoicism and from, you know, ancient philosophers, but many of these concepts are so applicable to today. So I'm sure I'm forgetting, you know,
yeah, I know it's yeah, I know. Yeah, absolutely.
But these are the ones that came to my mind right now.
Absolutely. It was such a wonderful pleasure, Amer, conversing with you. We could have gone on and on and on. And thank you so much for doing this. There are a lot of takeaways that I've had, and of course our readers and audiences would have. Thanks so much.